Hi everyone, welcome to Leafkins Draw This in Your Style, the show where I take your Draw This in Your Style challenges and turn them into Leafkins. This episode is inspired by a Draw This in Your Style challenge by Cutest Introvert on Instagram, where I will be turning this into this. Let's get started. So I've got the original artwork up in the corner, and I'm using it as a guide as I go through my sketching. And especially for this rough sketch, I'm intentionally trying to keep it as loose and fluid as possible. I'll do anywhere from 3 to 5 sketch iterations. For this first pass, I'm really just trying to get the shape down, get the skeleton of the drawing onto the page, and not get bogged down in unnecessary detail. I'm using a big, thick charcoal brush and avoiding minutia as much as I can. Once I have something that I'm okay with, I think looks close to what I'm going for, I'll drop the opacity and start cleaning it up for the second sketch phase. This is basically just picking the lines that I like from the rough sketch, reinforcing the ones that I think work and ignoring the ones that I don't like to give sort of a more cohesive, clean product that I can then manipulate. So once I've got that down, I will drop the opacity again and start on a third pass, which is a little bit cleaner, using a smaller brush, refining the lines that I have, just so that there's no ambiguity when I take it into the clean inking stage. I really don't want to be finding my lines once I'm inking. I want it to be pretty clear, so it's just making sure that it looks clean and cohesive. I think I intended this to be the last sketch, but halfway through I realized it wasn't going to be, and so I took it a little bit less seriously. I think I lost faith in this sketch as I was going through, and I just sort of rushed through it. There you can see how I think a good thing to do when you're sketching is to occasionally flip your drawing. I think flipping it horizontally in the case of Photoshop so that you can see it from a different angle. Usually when I do that, things like face proportions and sort of pose anomalies will jump out at me, and then I'll manipulate them in the flipped view and then flip them back. Once I've done that, I lower the opacity and do one final sketch layer where I'm consciously picking the lines that I know are going to be the final lines in the inking process and making any final adjustments, simplifying where I need to and adding any final details. I think my biggest piece of advice while you're sketching would be, once it gets to a point that you're happy with, just move on. Don't work it to death, because the more you work it at earlier stages, the busier it's going to look at later stages, and the less streamlined. So once I have a sketch that I'm happy with, I will export it from Photoshop, and I like to do my inking in Illustrator just because I feel like it's the easiest way to get super clean lines. When I draw, I like to have a really clean graphic style, so I feel that Illustrator is the best way of doing that. I know there's ways in Photoshop where you can use smoothing, which I do, but I like how every line is a separate element until you combine them in Illustrator, and I feel like it gives me a lot of freedom to sort of manipulate lines once I've put them down. So at this stage, I'm taking my rough sketch and I'm just putting down lines for all of the major sections. I'll probably speed this up later. It's not very interesting. One thing to keep in mind when you're working in Illustrator, it's gonna look really bad for the majority of it. It's just gonna look like spaghetti tangles of lines. You have to, again, trust that the final product is going to come together, which is difficult. It's very easy just to give up halfway through because it looks like just a mess of line that doesn't have any logic. But if you stick with it Just once you get to the point where you're setting up weights and thicknesses and cleaning it up, it takes a while, but when it comes together so quickly. And once I have all of the lines down, I will start working on sort of thicknesses and tapering. The first thing I do is usually isolate the major lines, like her jawline, her neck and shoulders, and her ears, and make those a little bit thicker. And then any sort of interior details, I will lower it a little bit. And then once I have that down, I'll go around sort of deciding where there needs to be a fine taper and where it's okay to keep it sort of a square edge, just to make the outlines flow a little bit nicer. Not worrying about whether it looks clean at this stage. It always looks gross when you first put all the lines down, and then it really comes together once you clean them up. Once all of the widths and tapering is completed, I unify the outline, and I go through and clean up all of the overhang. And I feel like this part is where the drawing really comes together. It starts looking really clean, like a sort of like a coloring book. I think the hardest part at this point is sort of remembering which lines you keep and which lines you get rid of. Occasionally I'll delete the wrong one, have to undo. Once the major lines are done with, I'll go back for a second pass of smaller, thinner detail lines, just to sort of break up the work. If you have too many lines going on, it's impossible to know which ones are for what. It just looks like a big mess of black. Once the lines are done, I will export it from Illustrator and bring it back into Photoshop. When I start coloring, the first thing I do is lay down the base colors. I think what initially drew me to this design was that she had like a cool lotus bun that sort of looked like a crown, but I thought it fit in really well with Leafkins. They always have plants on their heads, so it was a no-brainer. I start off initially trying to block in the sort of white smudges she has on her shoulders and neck, but I ended up not liking it, so I just saved it for later. It was weird. They remind me of Elsa's costume from Frozen 2, which I liked the second movie, but it really freaked me out how her clothes sort of looked like they were part of her skin. Like, she was just tattooed white from her neck down. Once I have the base color down, I'll usually go ahead and put in sort of the hard shadows. I try to work as non-destructive as possible so that I can always change things later. All the base colors are on their own layer, and any sort of gradients and shadows and effects that I add are isolated, so I can always go back and tweak things. I think the majority of the time I spend on my drawings is tweaking colors and opacities and effects. Once I have basic sort of color blocks and shadow blocks down, I'll go through and add in any sort of gradients. This really isn't a very good example because I think I went a little bit piecemeal, but normally I'll put down flat shadows and then go through with any sort of shading gradients. Once the shadows and shadow gradients are down, I'll go back in with highlights. Here I've been focusing on the hair separately from the skin or any other sort of effect. I'll go in and put in hard highlights, and then like I did with shadows, I'll put any sort of highlight gradients in, just to make it pop a little bit more. here are the skin gradients, and of course the blush. I didn't always do blush on sort of ears and cheeks, but it was so prevalent on Instagram that I just started doing it to fit in. And I mean, I like how it looks. It definitely adds sort of visual diversity to the skin tone, and it's really easy to do. But just hit the tips of the ears and the cheeks and the chin and shoulders, basically any joints. I mean, the rules around it are really weird, and it's not natural looking, but for some reason it looks really good. And I guess it looks even more unnatural for Leafkins because they're plant people with green skin. Here we go. Sort of fiddling with the shadows. I ended up not liking sort of the hard outline, and I tried to soften it and then realized that there was just too much light coming in from that angle, so I reduced the shadows entirely. Once I have the base color and shadows down, do some regular old grading, I decided to sort of drop the yellow from it to give it sort of a desaturated violet sort of look, and then did a little basic bloom effect to get the final look of the drawing. And here's the final product. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments. If you come across any cool draw this in your style challenges you'd like to see me work on, let me know. I may feature it in a video. Also, if you like my art and want to be the first to see new drawings, then follow me on Instagram. I've got the link in my description. Thanks again, everyone. See you next time.